I'm David Caputo, Professor of Political Science at Pace University in New York City, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture on the massive open online course, MOOC, called Road to the White House. I'm taping this 2 days after the South Carolina, Nevada results. South Carolina for the Republicans and the Nevada caucuses for the Democrats. So let me summarize what I think are the most important points for both, and we'll also spend a few minutes talking about what the week ahead, 10 days ahead, will be for both parties. So first of all, South Carolina Republican. Even though he received slightly more than a third of the votes, approximately 34% of the votes, this is clearly a major triumph for Donald Trump. In fact, the media are already talking about the fact that he's unstoppable after South Carolina. I think that's probably an overstatement, but let's come back to that in just a moment. But clearly, it's a clear win for Trump. Shows again that he is polling very well. He was within polling expectations. In fact, exceeded them a little bit. The second place finisher was Marco Rubio, and the third place finisher was Ted Cruz. Virtually a tie for second or a tie for third, depending upon how you look at it. I think probably the most significant thing that happened in South Carolina, however, has nothing to do with the first three candidates that I just mentioned. It really has to do with Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush, after receiving about 9% of the total vote in South Carolina, Republican vote in South Carolina, announced that evening that he was withdrawing from the race. And I would recommend, if you haven't had a chance to do so, go to C-SPAN and watch Bush's concession speech and his speech about withdrawing. I think it's a model that can be used by other candidates. I think it's a model, but probably more important than Jeb Bush's speech itself is what it represents. And I think this is an interesting question that people are just now starting to raise, and I want to raise it today, and that is, with Bush's demise and Trump's rise, and with Cruz's rise, approximately 60%, and add in Ben Carson, approximately 60% of the vote in South Carolina was really anti-Republican establishment. So is what we're seeing a change in party composition for the Republicans, that they're becoming less educated, perhaps more angry about the state of affairs in the United States, more nationalistic, and does it also mean that the establishment wing of the party, the wing controlled by the Bushes and other prominent Republicans, is in decline? Is it just in decline for this election, or is Trump and the dissidents, Carson and Cruz, really creating a new Republican Party? And what's the impact of that as we go forward? So we'll have to see what happens there. But going back to Governor Bush, I like to use this as an example. When you talk to most people, when you say, does money matter? Everyone says, yes, money matters. Money matters in every election, and whoever has the most money is going to, in most cases, win the election. Well, in this particular case, it wasn't true. Jeb Bush outspent his opponents probably 2 and maybe even 3 or 4 to 1. Between his campaign organization spending about $24 million over the first 3 contests, and the Jeb Bush PAC, Super PAC, spending well over $90 million. So together, probably $125 million at least spent by the Bush campaign, and for a total of what? Probably an aggregate of 6% of the votes, and no delegates. No delegates. So there are other resources other than money that are important in campaigns, and I think the Bush campaign personify that. Many would argue he was a reluctant candidate to start with, stayed reluctant, did not really get into the fray till after New Hampshire, and by then it was too late to do much in terms of carving out an important niche for himself. So let's talk about what's going forward. So I think there's some broader questions. As I mentioned, one, is this the beginning of a transformation of the Republican Party as it is known? Remains to be seen. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. Second, what's the strategy for Rubio and Cruz going forward? I mean, it doesn't do them any good to continue to tie for second place, especially given the relatively low percentage they're getting, 22, 23%. In some of the upcoming races, the Super Tuesday races, some of the threshold levels are at 20%, which means that if they don't at least get 20%, they're going to get 0 delegates. So Trump could actually win all the delegates in a state by simply winning with a 35 or 40% total. And this is not what the Republicans expected when they drafted their various rules and so forth in 2012 going forward. So I think Rubio and Cruz are faced with a very difficult set of things going forward. For Cruz, the problem is, can he broaden his appeal to other than just evangelical voters and very extremely conservative voters? And for Rubio, can he broaden his view to take in the Bush supporters and perhaps chip away at some of the Cruz supporters and some of Trump's supporters? Remains to be seen. But let's look for a second at the delegate count. Donald Trump has 67, Cruz has 11, Rubio has 10, Kasich has 5, and Carson has 3. Now, one of the interesting questions is, what are Carson and Kasich going to do? Carson's strategy is he's drawing votes clearly away from Ted Cruz. So as long as he stays in that 3 to 4 to 5, maybe 6, 7% that he's polling, would likely go to Cruz, will not, so that hurts Cruz. Kasich is drawing votes away from Rubio, and Kasich hopes to be able to carry the state of Ohio on March 8th, which would then put him in position with, I believe Ohio has 66 delegates, puts him in a strong position then, since it's a winner-take-all state, where he could in fact become more important. He also will be putting his a lot of money into the Michigan campaign. So strategies going forward, if you look at the money situation, Carson and Kasich have the least. Trump has a significant amount, but not as much as he had going in. He's going to have to infuse more money into his campaign. He's loaned the campaign the money to date. He's going to have to again loan the campaign that money going forward. Cruz is well funded. Rubio is relatively well funded. I'll be giving a lecture in a few days talking about the role of super PACs and PACs. And when I talk about that, you'll see why Ted Cruz is so well funded, and so is Rubio. All right, now for the Democrats. This was a very important race for both of them. I think in some cases, both of them can say that Nevada was a victory for them. Certainly for Mrs. Clinton, with a 53 to 47, about a 5 to 6% win, it's considered a victory for her. Not as commanding, however, as the 30-point lead that she had back in October before Sanders' people decided they would contest the caucuses. So for Sanders, he would obviously argue, 1, we came very close to winning. 2, we made up tremendous amount of ground. 3, we had a lot of interest in the campaign, and it helped us going forward. Both have some difficulties, and one is it's unclear, for instance, heavy Hispanic population in the Las Vegas area and in other parts of Nevada, but unclear and some difference of opinion as to how they actually voted. Some of the news organizations, based on their entrance polling, indicated that they thought Sanders had carried by a small percent the Hispanic vote, which would be earth-shaking. Others have contested that by looking then at where the Hispanic vote is, the precincts that concentrated it with Hispanic votes, and showing that they voted about 75 to 80% for Clinton. So it makes a big difference going forward. If in fact Sanders is breaking even or slightly beating her with the Hispanic vote versus Mrs. Clinton getting 80%, 75 to 80%, that 30% differential will determine a lot of delegates as we go forward. So we'll see who's right. It's another interesting example where some of the polling techniques used by the media you have to ask some questions about them, about that. I'll be talking about that a little later. Now, I think the Democrats have an issue, though, that's just beginning to be talked about, and that is, despite Senator Sanders getting a lot of excitement among the youth, and despite Hillary Clinton stressing the fact that she would be the first woman president, the Democrats are not getting the surge in turnout that they received in 2008 when Barack Obama was a candidate. Now, the importance of that is that, does it mean that most people are just blasé about this nomination? Or does it mean that perhaps the Democrats will not be able to attract new voters? And Barack Obama was very good. His organization was very good. If you turned out in 2008 for a caucus or a primary for him, they followed you through the general election and had you micro-targeted in terms of messages and so forth. So the Democrats are not generating the kind of excitement that the Republicans are. So it'll be interesting to see what that means going forward. Okay? Now, for the Democrats, in terms of delegates, they're basically tied, depending on which count you want to look at, 50 to 50, 61, 61. But there's an important but here. If you include the superdelegates, remember there are about 700 superdelegates, and about 500 of them have indicated who they would support. Now remember, that's not binding, can change at any time, but about 450 plus have indicated they're going to support Clinton. Only about 17 have said Sanders. The implication of that should be clear. It means that Senator Sanders is in the hole by about 400 delegates that he has to make up, and we'll come back and talk about that when I lecture on Super Tuesday. So for Sanders, he is going to have to gain a disproportionate amount of delegates going forward in order to catch Mrs. Clinton. So in the case of the Democrats, there are no winner-take-all states. Everything is proportional. Proportional at the congressional district and proportional statewide. So if they run 50-50 and split the delegates 50-50, Mrs. Clinton would go into the, and the superdelegates stay as they are, Mrs. Clinton has the potential to go into the convention with 300 plus votes, which would make it very difficult for Sanders to prevail. So Sanders proportionally has to carry a larger and larger number of these delegates. So the week ahead, for the Republicans, they move on to the Nevada caucuses, which clearly favor, and all the polling would indicate that Donald Trump will win there, which sets him up very nicely for the Super Tuesday states and the large number of delegates that are available there. For the Democrats, they have a very important primary in South Carolina. And that primary is significant for both because it again is a test for Secretary Clinton's argument that she will fare much better with diverse voters than Senator Sanders will, and in South Carolina, 52% of those voters are diverse in the Democratic primary. So again, can she turn those people out? Do they turn out in large numbers? Do they vote for her in large numbers? So it remains to be seen, but going into the race, she has a 5 to 8 point lead with a week to go. So it'll be interesting to see what finally happens in South Carolina. So we've more or less ended the warm-up. We're now ready, after South Carolina, Democrat South Carolina and Nevada Republican caucuses, we're now really ready for the beginning of the main events. And the first main event is on March 1st, and I'll be talking about that in the next lecture. Thank you.